I used to love climbing around the rocks and cliffs when I was a young kid. I'd sometimes go out by myself, which was stupid in retrospect, and climb across rocks, go into the tiny shallow caves, or traverse the coastline until the tide came in. I recently returned to my hometown and wanted to hit a nostalgia. I went back down to the coast and started walking onto the rocks. I got carried away and started climbing around the coastline, around steeper and bigger rocks. I remembered those tiny caves and headed out for them, ignoring the incoming tide. After about 20 minutes, I saw an entrance to a small cave, and so headed down it. I gripped the rocks with my now freezing fingers, cutting myself on the sharp edges in the process. Little cuts and bumps that hurt so much more when your body is icy cold. I squeezed through the cave entrance and climbed over the rocks inside, entering a narrow passageway. It was pitch black, and I had no idea how deep or long the cave was, so I just kept going. I must have left my brain at home, because in hindsight I know how dangerous this was. At the time I was just enjoying the flashback to my youth, and the excitement of it all. The cave went back really far. It must have gone under the public road, and was not one I'd ever been in before. It had a few curves, a few inclines, so before I realized it, it was pitch black. I took out my iPhone and turned on the torch. The cave was narrow and went on further back than my torchlight could illuminate. I could feel the breeze coming from further in, which I thought meant there may have been another entrance apart from the one that I came through. I didn't know if that was the case, as I never got far enough. Standing still and looking into the torchlit gloom, all I could see were rocks and small pools of water collected from the previous day's tide. I decided I'd had enough, so started to go back the way I came. As far as I could tell, there was only one route, the one I'd come through, so it wasn't as if I could get lost. I walked back for a few minutes, but then started to feel uneasy about the inclines, and the general curve of the passage felt different. I shone the torch all around, up, down, between rocks, everywhere, looking for a potential other passageway. There was none, so I carried on. A few more minutes passed, and I felt really confused. I should have started to see sunlight. I wasn't that far in. I stopped and shone the torch around again, but there was no other way to go. I once considered going back in again to see if I'd entered a different direction by accident at the point I'd reached earlier, but decided against it. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me. My anxiety was simply making time feel longer. I carried on. Sunlight did not appear, and the cave started heading downwards, deeper than I had remembered. I decided to stop before I had a panic attack. It was so dark. It was no different between having my eyes opened or closed. I put the phone's torch back on, but all it did was shine light on the narrow passage and the rocks around me. There was nothing else to see, and I began to feel claustrophobic. I suddenly turned the light off and closed my eyes. I tried to control my breathing, taking deep breaths in and slowly releasing them. My mind raced with possibilities. I could freeze if I couldn't get out, or worse, drown if the tide came fully in with me. After a minute of breathing exercises and rational thoughts about the logic of my fear, I carried on. Sure that I was only a few steps from seeing natural light again, the passage curved round and got a little wider, so my arms were not both touching the walls at the same time. I flicked the torch on to check my footing and immediately panicked. On the ground, just a few feet away, was a grubby old sleeping bag. Next to it was an empty tin and a small flick knife. My heart started pounding. I started pointing the torchlight in all directions, but there was nothing, no one. There was the path going back to the way I came and the way ahead, but no other options. I stared at the makeshift camp. The sleeping bag was old, damaged, wet, and dirty. The tin was empty and clean. The knife looked old and not too sharp. I considered going back. The idea of bumping into someone crazy or desperate enough to live in a cave like this was too much to bear. But what if it was someone back the other way? My head felt dizzy, and my legs were weak. I rested against the rocks and tried to breathe gently again. But it was no use. I was having a full panic attack, and I started to hear noises coming from further back in the cave. They were like footsteps and scrapes. They started to get louder and closer. Amidst my panic, I bent down and grabbed the knife. I held it in my right hand, with my phone as a torch in my left, and headed on down the passageway. Something stroked against my ear, so I spun around, cracking my temple against a sharp, jutting stone. My eyes flashed with blurry stars, and I thought I saw the outline of a man. He was tall and thin with long arms and a wide stance. I didn't stop to confirm his presence. Instead, I stumbled, not focusing on my footing on the rocks, often scratching my arms and banging my head. I didn't care. I just had to get out of there. If I met someone in my way, I was ready to stab the hell out of them and just get past. Nothing else mattered at that point. I stumbled for goodness knows how long, bumping, getting scratched, and gripped with fear that someone was following me. Suddenly, I heard voices coming from up ahead, and I managed to start panicking even more. I began to start to rush forward, holding the knife in front of me, no longer caring about the bangs on my head or the blood rushing along my arms from 100 tiny cuts that I had. It was then that I finally saw some light, torchlight. All of a sudden, I walked down a slope and I met the entrance of the cave, clambered through into knee-deep water. The tide was rising, but had not yet reached its peak. Most disturbingly, it was nighttime. Not just getting dark, but full-on moonlight. For the first time since making my way into the cave, I looked at the time on my phone. It hadn't seemed important before. It was almost 10 p.m. I'd been inside the cave for 7 hours? My phone began to buzz with activity. Texts, voicemails, WhatsApp messages, clearly reestablishing itself with network signal, and waded through the water to the nearby rocky steps and pulled myself up onto them. I started to notice the pain racking in my body, following the bruises I'd given my legs and cuts over my arms, and the lumps forming around my head. I felt as though I was going crazy. Surely I'd only been in there for 30 minutes, maybe an hour at most. I called my wife and without explaining, just told her to pick me up. She was panicked, furious, and relieved. When she had arrived, I got in the car and told her the story. She thought I was going crazy and put it down to blind panic. She pointed out that the tide wasn't yet at its highest and would have surely flooded the cave. Therefore, there was no way someone would be living in there. And even if there were, they'd be frozen to death at night. I might have imagined it. Maybe I had blacked out, she suggested, but maybe I knew that I hadn't. I had been on my feet and upright the whole time. I'm sure of it. My eyes had not been lying to me. Something happened in there that I can't explain. At the time, my senses had definitely been messed with. I'd never been so afraid before, and I've had nightmares of that cave since. I can't get it out of my head, but I'm sharing it with you in hopes that it acts as some sort of a release. I'm here considering going back there. I wonder if by going back and seeing it, that it's totally normal, maybe I can release some of this anxiety and get the normality back in my life. Now that I'm thinking about it, I might even drive down there tomorrow. If I lose another night's sleep because of this insanity, then I might really go crazy. Maybe I'll drive down there right now. I think it could be the only way to get past this. I have to face it again to cure myself.